My name is Lindsay Robinson, and I am the Director of Development at MAPS. I have been working in the drug policy reform space for around 20 years. I spent a decade working with the Marijuana Policy Project, and then I ran the California Cannabis Industry Association for 6 years, and I have the honor and privilege and challenge of directing development at MAPS now, and I am incredibly proud to be up here with my colleagues. So I am going to do a quick introduction, but certainly encourage you if there's anything else you'd like to add, please do. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I give your mic away?
No, it's good because then if we all have them.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay.
Check.
Okay. Great. So I'm going to start off by introducing Betty. We did not mean to wear the same jacket or both have bangs, but that's what happened. So here we are. Betty Aldworth serves as the Director of Communications and Post-Prohibition Strategy, which is a name that you and title that you fought hard for, so congratulations on that. Prior to joining MAPS, Betty was the Executive Director of Students for Sensible Drug Policy, which I'm sure we have in the house. Do we have any SSDPers? They're always in the rafters. I like that about SSDP. She was an incredible leader in the drug policy reform space. Betty was also the spokesperson and advocacy director for the campaign to regulate marijuana like alcohol in Colorado in 2012, which led to the legalization and regulatory framework in that state. And that's also when I met Betty. I was helping to fundraise for that initiative back in the day. So welcome, Betty. Next, we have Ismail Ali, who is our Director of Policy and Advocacy. Izzy is in a leadership role which helps design, build out, and implement psychedelic policy reform across the country and the world. If you haven't had the pleasure of hearing Izzy speak, I'm so glad that you all are with us right now. He also is co-founder and co-chair of the board of the Psychedelic Bar Association and has been working in drug policy reform for over a decade. And most recently, Izzy organized the Central California Psychedelic Summit, which was a smashing success where he brought together almost 300 people in his hometown of Fresno, California. So thanks for joining us, Izzy.
Yeah, Izzy.
And next, Stephen Huang is MAP's first Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Officer, also known as JEDI. And he is now our Director of Social Justice. Congratulations. Stephen is leading teams across our organization to address the psychedelic ecosystem's inequality challenges, as well as its opportunity to provide collective liberation. Stephen has designed and implemented JEDI strategies for organizations across diverse industries, including the tech sector, and he joined MAPS in 2021. So I am just really honored to be on stage with some OGs in the policy reform space, and we are really happy to be here to share some of what's next for MAPS. So before we hop into that, I do want to ask each of the panelists to add something that is not in a traditional bio, since all of them speak frequently to the media on stage, in podcasts, in our all-hands meetings at MAPS, to add something that maybe folks don't know about them. So Stephen, I'm gonna ask you to go first.
I discovered my passion and my dharma for DEI and psychedelics at a rave. Yes. At a music festival, I was high, I was co-using a lot of different substances in the middle of a crowd. And I was like, what is this feeling that I want, like the world to feel like this? And I had to integrate that and make sense of it. But that experience really pivoted the arc away from tech and more towards nonprofit and psychedelics and justice, away from my previous career as a life insurance actuary.
And we're so glad that it did.
Thank
Welcome.
God for LSD.
Yes, thank God for LSD. Okay, Betty, you're next.
Well, thank you, Stephen, for, is this, you guys can hear me? Okay, great. Thank you, Stephen, for queuing it up. I was really struggling with like, what haven't I told everyone? I'm like so inappropriately open, but about things. But I started advocating for, I have never been an active user of a substance before I started advocating for the rights of other users. When I started doing advocacy for cannabis in 2009, I had quit cannabis because I'm very sensitive to THC. I hadn't used psychedelics since my early 20s when I started working on psychedelic reform at SSDP. And I had stopped using stimulants other than caffeine again in my early 20s before I started advocating for stigmatized drug users. So it's always been from that like social justice lens, but also and human rights lens. But also I learn a lot when I get into spaces with people who are active users, and have since expanded my personal experiences in ways that have been really transformative and healing.
Thank you, Betty. I appreciate that. Okay, you're up, Izzy.
I'm learning the harmonica.
That was a zinger. I was not expecting that. Okay, let's get into it. So we're here to first start talking a little bit about MAPS's vision of the future of psychedelia. So I'd like to start with Betty in talking about this in the context of a post-prohibition world.
Yeah, so this is really exciting for me. I've been dreaming about, for 5 years, how do we show people what a post-prohibition reality looks like, right? How do we think about what we really want at the end of this drug war and demonstrate that to people who don't have an imagination for it yet, right? It's really hard for the general public to get behind the idea of something completely new unless they have a model for it. So one of the aspects of this post-prohibition work that I'm doing is trying to figure out how to take this vast amount of academic, regulatory, research information about drug regulation and drug decriminalization and drug use, and translate it to the public in a way that is tangible and understandable for people who aren't showing up to conferences like this. So what does that look like? Does it look like pre-prohibition? I don't think it does, right? I think it actually looks like a multimodal approach that embraces community sharing, that embraces home grow, that embraces regulated models, that embraces therapeutic models, that embraces traditional models, that allows people to understand drugs and how and their own relationships with drugs in a much more holistic sense. And how do we approach that work keeping the dignity of the individual centered first and foremost, and public health and safety centered second, right? Obviously, these are all very important aspects that will contribute to this work that I get to do, that I'll be working on in the future at MAPS. But like this idea of like, how do we get from where we are today to where we want to be, without necessarily constraining our imagination to the regulatory realities that we're stuck in right now, to these social realities, the norms, the ways in which we have to bend our ideal policies. This is Izzy's work, right? Bending our ideal policies into something that's palatable. That's a lot of Izzy's work. I get to take a moment to think about, what would it be if it were just exactly what we think is right? And there's so much incredible information out there that people have been working on in this field that I now get to carry into the world and try to translate to the general public. So that's what I'm thinking about right now, is like post-prohibition, what does this really look like? How is it equitable and just and centered in dignity?
Thank you, Betty. I do also want to encourage folks, if you have questions, we are going to try and leave a little bit of additional extra time because we want to hear from all of you if you have questions about MAPS work. So while you're here thinking about it. Okay, so Izzy, in speaking from a policy perspective, what would you like to add to that?
Just jumping off of what Betty was just sharing, which I agree with basically everything you said. I think that the first is recognizing that policy is not the cause of, but it's upstream of a lot of the kind of issues we're navigating. And I would say, kind of, you didn't say this exactly, but it's sort of like how to take a proactive versus a reactive lens. And a lot of us that have been working in drug policy for a while have thought a lot about the impact of like constant reactivity and what it means to be like pushing back against something that feels like it's pushing to us. And I think even having the room and space to think more, not just proactively, but in a visionary way that doesn't necessarily have the burdens and the weight and baggage of the way things are and the way that people we kind of think that they've always been, without the education to know otherwise, is itself like I think a testament to how the world is changing, not just with psychedelics, not even just with drug policy, but with like the possibility of creating more liberated paradigms in general. So speaking a little bit to the policy piece, just for a little bit of context, I started at MAPS 8 years ago. I was brought on by Natalie Ginsburg and Rick when the policy department was really starting. Prior to that point, Rick had done a lot of the kind of ad hoc policy work with respect to the regulatory agencies and the other pieces that had been coming up. Natalie was actually brought on to mostly focus on cannabis-related policy, which was really up at the time with respect to finding kind of a legal source for clinical trials, federally legal source for clinical trials with cannabis. And in the first few years, it was really, really focused, I would say, on like education and professional capacity building. It was finding people in these different aspects of the field and like supporting them and figuring out how to advocate or talk about psychedelics in a way that didn't make them sound totally crazy, which again, before the post-Michael Pollan era, like that was a thing that people had to learn how to do, and still is to a certain extent. But with Netflix documentaries and books and so on, the barrier to entry to participate in the system has lowered. The stakes are lower, so people don't have to sacrifice as much to participate, which means that the conversation is widening in a lot of interesting ways, and I think some good ones and some more challenging ones. So the last few years, really like in the wake, I would say in the lead up to Measure 109 in Oregon, and then since then, like really nonstop, a lot of my work and our department's work and our work together has been responding to, not just reacting, but responding to, and now slowly but surely creating some of these pathways for different kinds of approaches to policy reform. And the word I've been using a lot lately is harmonization. I think that there are a lot of folks who like have a particular perspective on where we should go. A lot of people look back, maybe people have heard me say this before, people look back at the war on drugs, at the reality of the current war on drugs, and they're like, this is not good. And then when we look forward and everyone has a different perspective of like, where do we go from here? And I like to remind people that I don't think any of us know exactly where to go from here. It doesn't look like it used to look necessarily. So my approach and the approach we've been taking at MAPS over the last at least 4 years, both at the state level as well as the federal level and international within the UN system, has been how do we harmonize different policy approaches? That is to say, if medicalization is an option, if regulated structures outside of medicalization are options, if decriminalization, spiritual practice, community use, traditional use, and so on are all part of this larger milieu, how do they work in conjunction with each other, in cooperation with each other, and not in competition with each other? And that's both, I think, from a general justice analysis frame, but it's also really looking at the individual and communities and preserving their right to have the choice, as long as it's in integrity, in sustainability, ecologically balanced, and so on, to participate in the system and with the medicine on their terms. And that's partially because of this awareness, and this came up earlier in a few panels, that like, maybe I won't go into my own perspective on like the kind of baseline morality of the medicine itself and its agency and consciousness and so on, maybe not, maybe that's for Q&A. But what I will say is I think that like we are realizing more and more how much priming and context really matters for the experience that a person has. And that you see that in preparation, integration, and the general container setting that's happening. Set the setting, as we like to say at MAPS. We're not just set and setting, but we are setting the setting. We're actually doing that as we create it. So I think like part of this whole like thing is like how do we look at people who've been left behind by the war on drugs, people who are formerly incarcerated and impacted by the system, people who are looking at not just medical access for a treatment or a diagnosis, but also who are seeking for personal use, expansion, community, relational elements. So I can talk more in detail maybe later, but like the general approach that we've been taking with our policy department and with our work over the last few years is like, how do these work together, and how do we learn from each other as we go? Because we're going to keep refining as we go forward and continue to make mistakes too.
Thank you. I really appreciate that answer. Shifting a little bit, Stephen, this is no easy question, but can you speak to our work around inclusion and healing for all?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think both of you talked about ending the war on drugs, and I think MAPS's policy win and social justice win and a win for human rights is really ending the war on drugs, and an acknowledgement and reparation for the fact that the war on drugs was a war on people that use drugs, mostly black and brown people, and we can all just talk about that, acknowledge that, and think about, and use our imagination for reparations for what that might look like. A post-prohibition future that focuses on biocultural conservation, and maybe regulation and taxes to give indigenous people some land back. Yep. I don't think that's crazy. I mean, we can use our imagination, right? Like, is 1% for the planet like enough? Like, I don't think so. So when I think about the future of MAPS from a social justice lens, I'm blessed that I work with these policy legends that actually embed social justice into everything they do, working with the Sentencing Commission, thinking about post-prohibition strategy. And I just try to make sure things stay on track. Yeah.
Thank you. Really appreciate that answer as well. So I do want to touch a little bit on the future of research and some projects that MAPS is engaging in, or hopefully will engage in very soon. So maybe Izzy will come back to you on it, and then folks can add in. And I definitely want this to be a little bit of a roundtable discussion if we can, so please feel free to add on wherever feels good.
I can just start with a couple things that we've been working on. So there has, thankfully, I think that there have been a lot of people who've talked about how to increase access of psychedelic care modalities of all kinds to people who are impacted at the margins, less likely, less affluent, and so on. And one of the populations that has come up a lot is formerly incarcerated people, and currently incarcerated people for that matter, but I'm not going to get into that today. So last year, we began a literature review process and are in the process now of kind of working with some potential collaborators to design a protocol, not initially a dosing protocol, but like surveys and focus groups to think through what are the kinds of ethical and legal issues and regulatory and compliance issues that might come up working with people who've been formerly incarcerated. I think that as people who've been in around drug war politics for a long time, we're all very close to people who've been impacted by the justice system in a lot of ways. And just holding that aspect as we go forward into like this like sometimes a little too hype-oriented direction with psychedelic therapy and psychedelic modalities just feels really important. So one of the collaborations that we're doing between the policy and the emerging research department, re-emerging I guess you could say research department at MAPS, is actually figuring out like, well, what are the kinds of things that we need to be looking at? Because there's a lot of interest both from like funders and there's a zeitgeist in the general community, but I see a little bit of that like enthusiasm, and you see this a lot with the psychedelic field, enthusiasm for desiring to help and benefit people kind of outpace the time it takes to understand the groundwork needed to do something in the right way, in an ethical way, in a balanced way. So that's just maybe one example that I'll focus on for now.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Okay, so thinking a little bit about the almost 40-year history of MAPS, and the amount of progress that have been made, the amount of setbacks, just really contemplating how long thoughtful policy reform actually takes. Anyone who's worked in this space for any amount of time probably really deeply understands that significant progress does not happen quickly. I'd love us to talk a little bit about the benefits and the baggage of our 40 years of work. Success, the struggle, backlash, what can we learn and build on, and what should we potentially leave behind? And I'm opening this to any of you that would like to start.
So in my communications work for MAPS, one of the very challenging elements, that one of the pieces of baggage, we shall say, is that because of our commitment to transparency, because of our commitment to creating an archive of all things psychedelic since the inception of MAPS, there is, as we have evolved as a community, right, we have learned so much, and we've learned that some of the things that we believed in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2010s, even, like last year, are not correct any longer. And yet, we maintain these things on our website, or they might be still stuck to us in certain ways that we are held accountable for today, even if no one at the organization, adheres to an idea like that. So it brings up some challenges that feel very, very difficult in the moment sometimes in the public critique. And so navigating that is absolutely a fascinating and I think important part of our work in the communications realm at MAPS, figuring out how do we, let the history be there and separate it from our current set of beliefs. And then another, frankly, I was really excited about doing this panel with Rick. I asked Bia, can we title it Betty and Rick Disagree About Things? And I really, really wanted to get into this whole idea of licensure for psychedelics that Rick talks about sometimes, because I think that it's a terrible idea, and I've told him so many times, but I was hoping to do that in front of you all. There is a lot of disagreement at MAPS amongst ourselves about what
It happens
the best,
a lot at staff meetings, just so you know.
all the time. It's spicy, y'all. Truly. And that's good. That is a real boon to the organization. It makes us stronger that we do have very respectful, well-reasoned, but intense disagreements about things. And I love that about us. But there are some ideas that, sometimes I'm like, really? Licensure for somebody who wants to take LSD on the weekend? Is this what we are talking about? Come on. So, there's that push and pull of Rick with his enormous personality and a lot of genius, but also sometimes that can overwhelm some of the other ideas that should be given a little more air in the public forum, that are mostly just aired internally at MAPS and don't happen in public spaces because people wanted to hear from Rick.
Are we going to bash on Rick this panel? My turn.
It's a
Tag
free
team
and
me in.
It's a free and safe space.
Oh my God, it's being recorded. Rick, don't fire me. I love you.
It's a safe space.
I know. One of the kind of Rick cultural things that bleeds into how we operate today, I get the sense that 40 years ago, MAPS felt like we had to do everything. We had to be the tip of the spear. We have to do harm reduction. We have to do patient assistance. We have to do all the research. We have to do biocultural conservation. We have to do everything. And we still have a little bit of that today where we try to do everything. And we've talked about this ad nauseum. When we try to do everything, we're actually not really doing everything that well, and there are probably a lot of organizations that could probably do harm reduction or patient assistance or this part of science better, because with more focus than we can. And so sometimes I wonder, is MAPS's role going to evolve to a place where we actually get to support all these other players and other stakeholders in the ecosystem, and we don't feel like we need to do everything ourselves? Does Rick hear that?
He hears it. I'll answer this question actually by looking at the name of the organization. So we were talking about this a little bit earlier on the panel this morning. But I think some of the baggage is in the term psychedelic studies, and maybe I'll point more specifically to psychedelic science. And there's a reason why we needed people in lab coats to tell us that things were okay for a really long time. And I understand the utility of that strategy and how a lot of the work that's been happening, especially politically, but also culturally and in general, may not have been possible. It's impossible to know, right? But may not have been possible without that kind of visibility and normalization of research within a Western materialist kind of mostly global north-oriented reductionist lens. And we're now in an environment where studies are taking us only so far. And I remember when I started working in policy about a decade ago, I was like, if you just have more research, then you have more proof, and have you more proof, you can show it to the people, and when the people see the proof, then they will know that their minds should change. And now I know that it's a little bit more complicated than that, and that in fact, political decision-making does not only happen because of evidence and new emerging research, which was a shock to my system. And it's actually much more complicated than that. So I do think that there's a certain level where that baggage has taken us really far, or that kind of orientation has taken us really far. And I think that there's a certain extent to which we're getting diminishing returns out of it, not just at MAPS, but within the field in general. And we're coming up against more like ethical, cultural level questions, existential philosophical questions that are not necessarily answered by like, do we have better research or not? So that's one. And on the flip side is the first two words, Multidisciplinary Association. That was a really good call from the beginning. And I think it goes to what you were saying. I think that we do have a lot of disagreement and different perspectives within the organization that are constantly being aired in private and public and semi-public and everything in between. And I think that that commitment has felt really important to me, to see like we're not only listening to one type of person even internally. And I think it cuts both ways, right? Part of this like desire to do everything is that everyone has their particular interest and focus, and I think finding the sweet spot within the Venn diagram of all of our interests, capacity, orientation, and expertise is sort of like where we'll find the answer to where to go from here as an organization too.
Yeah, I really like that. I also love that we work with such dynamic, varied voices, and that we are constantly putting ending the drug war and psychedelic exceptionalism at the forefront of conversations, both internally and externally. That is something I hope that we carry with us. Okay, so from your individual point of views, from your work, what are your biggest challenges today?
Kind of what I was saying earlier, actually. This is one of those things that also cuts both ways, which is the fact that because it is easier to talk about psychedelics in public, people have to sacrifice less to do it, which means that you have people who are more cynical and less invested, taking up a lot of space in the conversation. And I think that that's broadly true in a lot of the conversations around like how corporate commercial market influence enters the space, and that's been happening a lot over the last few years. And I think that, and the flip side to that is that like, I think one of the, this is spicy, I think one of the things that has made it hard to have certain kinds of progress within drug policy, in particular in cannabis, is that a lot of people who are coming from an activist perspective were so unwilling to talk about the nature of the market that they were left out of the conversation. So a lot of the decisions around the cannabis market was made by these large multi-state players because the activists were like, we don't like capitalism, so we're not going to talk about it. And I think the failure to talk about it, and again, I'm being really reductive here. A lot of people were talking about it, and there's a lot of space and ongoing kind of dialogue in the social equity movement that has gone specifically to this issue. So I'm speaking very broadly here. But I think that being willing to have like candid and like literally physically uncomfortable conversations about the nature of markets, geopolitical questions, like cross-border questions about where drugs come from, where they're sourced, how they're made, why they end up in people's noses or mouths or other places, like that actually is a really, really critical part of thinking about not just ending the drug war, but also like creating the post-prohibition world. Because like we can't do it if we're not thinking of the production companies, of the people from the curanderos to the cultivators, and then all what it takes to get the medicines to, insert other healing, center here, retreat center here, whatever.
Yeah, and you've talked about the harmonious ecosystem before, and I think that's really part of my vision of the future of psychedelia, and probably one of the biggest challenges that I see. Being MAPS's first Jedi officer and then putting social justice in my title, I get a lot of valid and heated perspectives from people in the psychedelic ecosystem. And I think the biggest challenge for me, it's something that I've actually seen doing DEI work for a long time, is if you just took the people in this room, for example, we probably mostly agree on 80% of what we're trying to accomplish and what we want to do and what we believe in and the potential for this movement. But that 20%, I'm not trying to bypass the 20%, there's a core 20% that we disagree on that is worth discussing and is worth deliberating on. But what I've noticed in the psychedelic ecosystem, even beyond this room, is so much inability to find common ground with people that we mostly agree with. A lot of toxic, trying to cancel each other, not willing to hear out the other side. And there are a lot of well-meaning people that are kind of stuck on the sidelines because they actually don't want to get involved in such a heated, ugly space. And I think as stewards of this movement, we need to create an ecosystem that has harmony, where our disagreements can be a source of strength and not adversity.
That's fair. That's great. Thank you, Stephen.
I think the overarching biggest challenge in my work is the push and pull between urgency, a sense of urgency, and a need for intention. I feel that urgency in my own life. I see that urgency in the eyes of so many people who are suffering, who need these treatments to be available and accessible. And I see the need for intention when we're looking at how we think about medicines with long traditions attached, that are carried by long traditions. When I think about how I didn't want to talk about capitalism when we were legalizing cannabis, and the ways that I contributed to the system that exists today, and the weight that I carry for that. And so the desire to move quickly to ease the suffering of people who are incarcerated, of people who are experiencing serious mental health conditions, of the people who are not going to live until August when the FDA makes their decision on MDMA-assisted therapy because their PTSD is too painful. And knowing that we have to be intentional and thoughtful in an inclusive dialogue with our allies as we approach these moments is sometimes a very hard, path to walk. Yeah. Very challenging.
I feel that. Thank you, Betty. So before we open it up to questions, I would love to pose one final question to y'all, if you feel like sharing. What are you most worried about right now in the ecosystem, or even within MAPS? What keeps you up at night? Do you want me to go first?
Lindsay, what keeps you up at night?
I have thoughts on that. Well, as the director of development at MAPS, my primary focus is on fundraising. MAPS is a very large, well-resourced organization, and our nonprofit philanthropic work has changed the landscape in many ways, and most of which has been for better, but some of which has created a more challenging dynamic. And as we open the door for change, more for-profit companies are coming into the space without potentially a connection to drug policy reform, to ending the drug war, and a commitment to actually create systemic change and think about inclusion and healing for all, and are really there to make money. And that, I think, provides unique challenges for fundraising, but also in terms of how we're shifting consciousness and creating access. So that's something that I think about quite a bit.
I guess I'll go take this a little bit further. Is now that MAPS is a well-resourced, somewhat grassroots organization sitting in this now in more industrial space, is one thing I worry about is MAPS going taking up too much funding from other grassroots organizations that are probably better positioned in the ecosystem to stand up pillars, which is a humble brag that our development team is fantastic. How many of the nonprofit, grassroots organizations have a development team, let alone a development person with decade plus of experience? Like I don't want to say suck up a lot of money. We take. We suck up a lot of money. What if the money that we sucked up went to 10 other organizations? What could they do?
Well, which is why I'm so excited that we have officially launched our fiscal sponsorship program and our granting programs, in which we're going to raise tens of millions of dollars in order to do that, because policy reform is not cheap. So in the 40 years that MAPS has been around, we have probably raised $180 million, and we have one molecule that is now with a modality, one molecule and one modality, assisted therapy, moving through the FDA process. Yeah. So if we had tens of millions of dollars, think about all of the other programs and all of the other molecules and all of the other benefits and all the other societal change. And so when we think about large corporations benefiting in the cannabis space and contributing nothing to ending the war on drugs and not giving back to their communities and not talking about reparations or social justice, that is something that cannot happen in this space. So that is, my hope is that MAPS's work will continue to create a space where we can elevate all different types of work, because all of it is needed and there's room for all of it, and there is funding for all of it as well. So we need to create a space where we're supporting each other. And I'm super proud of our fiscal sponsorship and grants work. And hopefully some of y'all will be a part of that too, if you're not already. So, okay, biggest fears. And then I'd love to open it up to questions. If you all want to share or not.
Yeah. I think that y'all would probably think I'm very disingenuous if I sat up on this stage and didn't talk about the ICER report and the petition and the criticism of the clinical trials that have come to MAPS, that have, the criticism of that work. And there are the ways in which that is attached to MAPS and the ways in which that is not are something that keep me up at night, because there are a lot of elements of those arguments, the allegations and the critiques, that I feel like with more nuance could be much better understood by the people in this room, by the people who are writing the critiques, by the people who are receiving them. But that's not my job anymore. That's Lykos's job, and I have a duty to leave a lot of that to them. And yet, MAPS, of course, feels a lot of that critique. And we hold responsibility for some of it, right? It is a lot of the things that are being critiqued are critiques of when MAPS was more, or had control over, was the study sponsor, right? Was more participating in the design of the studies and the training of the therapists and all of those sorts of things. But we have a duty to let the IND sponsor, the people who are responsible for carrying this through the FDA, do the speaking on it, right? And so, so that's a bit, figuring out how we can speak to the things that are ours and take responsibility for them and accountability for them, and make sure that the things that are ours are addressed proactively in any future trials that we might consider, having a big hand in, and using those lessons to share with others and, continue our practice of open science and open books. That's something that is very challenging as well.
Yeah, thank you.
What actually keeps me up at night right now is the Israeli government's ongoing occupation, massacre, and violence in Gaza and the West Bank. And directly speaking to the question, I think a lot about how MAPS engages with what's happening in Israel and Palestine. MAPS is not an organization that adheres to BDS. In other words, MAPS has relationships with Israeli organizations and has a nonprofit independent affiliate in Israel, which got a lot of attention in its co-participation, co-sponsorship of a conference that was going to be in Tel Aviv first in December and was pushed back to July of this year. Maybe I'll start with just a few facts and elements of my own relationship to this, not on a personal level, but through the organizational lens. I learned after joining the organization now 8 years ago that there have been, and Rick had attempted, and other people in our universe had attempted and have attempted to be in relationship to Muslim, Arab countries across the diaspora, across the West Asian continent for a number of years. And the work in Israel became very visible and very open very quickly, in part because of a few different factors, but mostly I think people who are willing to be visible there. And the people who are involved in MAPS Israel, who started the organization, who participated in our phase 2 and 3 clinical trials, were part of that group of people who were willing to be visible and open about this topic there. There have been and had been ongoing attempts at being in relationship not just with other countries in the region, like Lebanon and Jordan, but also active conversation with people in, for example, the Gaza Health Ministry as early as the early 2000s. Now, you can imagine how hard it would be, if not impossible, if not disingenuous, for white Americans to come into a place like Gaza and to say, like, hey, we're working with the nation of Israel, we would love to bring this medicine to you too. So I don't fault the fact that those conversations were unable to move forward in that context at that time, or haven't been able to since then, in many ways. At the same time, I have been wondering and following this issue myself in my own life for a very, very long time. I'm very close to and in relationship to Palestinian friends, mentors, and family for my entire life as a Muslim person, first generation here in the United States. And as this issue, which has been on my mind and on the minds of a lot of us pretty much the entire time that I've been at the organization and in thinking about how to engage and just be in integrity in my own life with my own community with this issue, I started looking into and wanting to better understand exactly how MAPS could, if at all, from its own organizational position, speak to and engage with this stated desire of healing for all. So while, for a lot of reasons, a lot of the people who we've been in relationship and dialogue with in parts of the Muslim Arab world have not been able to and had not been able to be visible, that is slowly starting to change. It was interesting that in December of this year, when a lot of the issues were coming up around MAPS Israel, we were also invited by some allies of ours to participate in a conversation in the UAE in conjunction with the government of the UAE on mental health, integrated mental health in the region. There's a lot of complex politics around that kind of underlie even that issue, but speaking directly to this, I want to say a couple things. The first is that it was really interesting being in UAE as a Muslim person who's thought about this intersection of Islam and psychedelics for a long time. And UAE is an interesting place because while it has a lot of complex politics and dynamics that maybe, again, are outside of the scope of this specific conversation, it's interesting because it's one of the few places in the region that people from almost every country in the region can attend. There aren't active security elements that prevent people like there are from going to Syria or other places. So that means that when we're thinking about how to have access to psychedelic education, therapy, training, and so on in the region, we can't just base it in a country like Israel. We had to look at other places and have to look at other places. And part of what we were doing in UAE in January was figuring out where and who in those health systems, many of whom, by the way, are Palestinian, because there have been Palestinians who've been going to UAE and participating in that larger world for some time now, how exactly to bring whatever little, meager, humble bit of knowledge and information that we've developed here at MAPS to places like that. So a lot of those conversations are still in process. Our relationship and what we've done in UAE in particular is emergent. We went in January hoping to go back later this year, hoping to expand that. I'm particularly interested, as I spoke a little bit earlier today, about this question of Islam and psychedelics and psychedelic healing in particular. But going back to this specific issue, how MAPS relates to this topic keeps me up at night. and how I sit within it in my positionality, how we can speak, how do we in integrity say that we want healing for all when so much funding, so much attention is going to one place and not others. I'll end by saying that at the conference there was a panel there about mental health in active conflict zones, not past conflict zones, active conflict zones. There were 2 doctors, psychologists from Ukraine that were in Ukraine at the time. There were 2 Palestinian health experts, including Sama Jabr, who some of you may be familiar with as the head of Gaza's mental health authority, who wrote an article about there being no post in post-traumatic stress disorder when you're a Palestinian in Gaza or in the West Bank. And they had a couple people from Doctors Without Borders. And it was an interesting conversation because it's really hard. And you know, we, especially in the West, in this kind of open global North world, we're getting more comfortable talking about mental health. And I think that's a really good thing overall. And it's giving more space to people to have some of that room to be like, okay, like, wait, mental health is a thing. And that is a huge privilege because we're not dealing with the ongoing assault of our lives, property, space, territory, and so on. Not speaking for all of us, because some people here are. But I say that to say that, like, making the room for that, there is a, I don't want to use the hierarchy of needs, but there's a certain level of baseline truth, balance, justice that's needed to get into the luxury of talking about mental health. And some of the issues that are related to mental health are not just about our psychology and about our diagnosis, but also our social environment and where we're born and where we live and what oppressive forces we're subjected to. So I just hope for ongoing conversation about this. I do appreciate and engage with as much of the critique and concern that I can on a personal level. I've only personally started talking about it more visibly in the very, very recent past because it's very, very challenging to do it on a stage in an environment where a lot of things aren't clear and can't be made clear for a lot of reasons yet. And I don't want to be like, just trust me, bro, because I understand why people don't. So there's maybe more to say about that, but I'll pause there because I know we're at the end of time, and thank you all for listening to that.
Thank you so much. Wow. Okay. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm hoping we have a couple minutes for questions. We went a little bit longer than I hoped.
No.
We are kind of out of time, although Bia said if anyone wants to come up and challenge MAPS, they might have time to sneak something in.
Take one hard critique. How about that? Oh, there's none? Okay, great.
Okay.
Yeah, if you could come down that's accessible, that would be great. Yeah.
Anyone. People are Russian. Just kidding. Here.
Thank you. I appreciate y'all giving us a couple extra minutes. Oh, wait, do you need a microphone? Oh, thanks, Stephen.
This may relate to the last comment there. When I think about the global future of psychedelia, which is a big topic, I'm reminded of Stan Grof's famous definition of psychedelics as non-specific amplifiers or catalysts of psychological processes. And so I wonder, from each of your perspective, what, as you look forward, do you hope psychedelics will either amplify or catalyze, if you had to pick?
That's a great question. Thank you. Yeah.
That's not a challenge, that's a nice one.
Yeah, that's a great question. And also maybe we can try and end on like a positive, inspirational note since we're at the end of the conference. And there was someone in one of the talks that I went to earlier that had asked the panelists to leave us all with a little bit of inspiration and some hope for the future, since this work is really hard and the world is really heavy. And I would love to invite you to, any of you, if you'd like to take that on.
I would hope that it amplifies our ability to see past the paradox. That's a MAPS principle, by the way. Because I feel like it's really, really hard to have this conversation if you're only looking at it from one angle.
I'm also going to cite a MAPS principle, which is so annoying. Consciousness without criminalization, y'all. Like, let people have dignity and human, like, basic respect for each other, recognizing that our interconnectedness that becomes visible to so many of us through psychedelic experiences means that if mushrooms can make us love trees more, Can it not let us love other people more too? And honor them as human beings worthy of dignity and respect, no matter what drugs they choose to use?
Thank you. Yeah.
I guess I will take the MAPS principle of healing for all, since we're doing this.
Sorry, guys. I mean, you know what you came for.
Yeah. I would love for us, for psychedelics to help us think about what equity really means in this future of psychedelia, where there is going to be a pathway for people that want a controlled clinical environment, and very much encouraged as a community-based practice, which is how psychedelics have been practiced for millennia, where there's a community care-based model where things can be free and everyone has access to the tools they need to heal themselves.
Inshallah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm really honored to work with all of you, and I'm so grateful to have been able to MC this panel or moderate this panel. Thank you all for sticking it out with us. We appreciate you very much.
Thank you all so very much. And thank you so much again to Bia and the organizers and the whole team. I think that's what's about to happen. Okay, let's do this.
Thank you, Shakruna, for an amazing conference, huh?
Yeah.